"You people always come in here with stories," Deputy Lucas Hale said, his voice flat but loud enough to cut through the room. And just like that, the low murmur inside the station died, conversations folding into silence as every pair of eyes drifted toward the front desk, where an elderly black woman stood alone beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, her hands resting gently on the worn leather strap of a small purse that looked older than most of the officers watching her posture straight. Despite the weight of the moment, despite the way the deputy's words lingered in the air like something heavier than sound, the clock on the wall ticked past 9:14 a.m., each second sharp, mechanical, indifferent, while a printer hummed quietly in the background, spitting out paperwork no one reached for. And somewhere near the back a chair creaked as someone shifted but said nothing. Because no one wanted to be the first to interrupt what was unfolding, Evelyn Brooks didn't raise her voice, didn't step back, didn't lower her eyes. She simply stood there in her neatly pressed gray coat, the fabric catching the cold light, her silver hair pulled back in a careful bun, her expression calm in a way that didn't match the tension building around her, as if she had already lived through louder moments than this and had learned what mattered and what didn't. Lucas leaned forward slightly, one hand pressing down on the counter, the other tapping a stack of forms with controlled impatience, his badge catching the overhead light, flashing briefly like a signal, his jaw tight as he looked at her not as a person, but as a problem to be processed, something to move along, something that didn't belong here longer than necessary. "You're telling me you lost your identification and now you want us to just—" "What?" "Take your word for it," he continued, each word measured, clipped, practiced, the kind of tone that sounded official but carried something else underneath it, something colder, something that made the space between them feel wider than the few feet that separated them. Evelyn's fingers shifted slightly on her purse, not trembling, not gripping, just adjusting, as if grounding herself in something familiar. And when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady, clear enough to carry without effort. "I'm not asking for favors, officer. I'm asking for help." And for a moment the words seemed to hover, not confrontational, not pleading, just simple, just true, and that made them harder to dismiss. Lucas exhaled through his nose, a faint shake of his head, the kind of reaction that suggested he had already decided what this interaction meant before it had even begun. And behind him a younger officer glanced down at his desk, avoiding the scene, while another shifted her weight, arms crossing, unsure whether to step in or stay still. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a pale reflection across the polished floor, and in that reflection Evelyn's silhouette looked smaller, thinner, but somehow more grounded than everything around her, like she was anchored to something deeper than the room itself. Lucas straightened, reaching toward the side of his belt where a pair of standard-issue cuffs rested, not drawing them, not yet, but letting his hand hover there just long enough for the implication to settle into the space between them, a quiet escalation that didn't need words to be understood, and the air shifted again, tighter now, heavier, as if the entire room had taken a breath it wasn't ready to release. And still, through it all, Evelyn Brooks did not move. The silence did not break. It stretched, thin and fragile, like glass under pressure, and Evelyn Brooks remained exactly where she stood, her shoulders relaxed, her chin level, her eyes steady not on the badge or the hovering hand, but on Lucas Hale himself, as if she were looking past the uniform into something deeper that he had not expected anyone to notice, and that alone unsettled the rhythm he was trying to control. Her purse shifted slightly against her side as she adjusted her grip, the soft creak of aged leather barely audible against the low electrical hum of the lights. And for a brief moment her gaze flickered toward the far wall, where a faded bulletin board displayed community notices, missing pet flyers, and a photograph of a neighborhood picnic from years ago, colors dulled with time, but faces still smiling. And there was something in the way she looked at it, not longing, not regret, just recognition, as if she remembered a version of this place that felt different, one that did not require her to explain her presence before being acknowledged. Lucas cleared his throat, the sound sharper than necessary, pulling attention back to him as he straightened his posture, trying to reclaim the authority that had begun to slip in ways too subtle for most to name but too real for him to ignore. And he reached for a clipboard, flipping it open with a quick motion that echoed louder than it should have in the quiet room. "Name," he said, not a question but a command, his pen poised above the paper, waiting, and when Evelyn answered, "Evelyn Brooks." Her voice carried the same calm weight as before, unhurried, unshaken. And Lucas wrote it down with deliberate strokes, as if pressing harder might make it more official, more controlled, more. "His date of birth," he continued, eyes fixed on the form, and she answered again, each detail given without hesitation, without apology, and as the information filled the page the tension did not ease. It shifted, becoming something quieter, more internal, like a current running beneath still water, because this was no longer about missing identification. It was about who was believed, who was doubted, who was seen, and who was reduced to a line on a form. Behind them, the station door opened, briefly, letting in a slice of morning light that cut across the floor in a pale rectangle before closing again with a soft thud. And in that fleeting brightness, Evelyn's silhouette sharpened, her presence defined not by the space she occupied, but by the stillness she maintained within it. And one of the officers near the back glanced up, watching her with something closer to curiosity than judgment, as if trying to understand how someone could stand so quietly in a moment designed to make them feel small. Lucas tapped his pen once against the clipboard, then again, the rhythm uneven, betraying a restlessness he did not acknowledge, and he finally looked up, meeting her eyes fully for the first time, expecting perhaps uncertainty, or fear, or irritation, something he could respond to, something he could categorize. But what he found instead was composure, steady and unyielding, and it lingered just long enough to disrupt his next words before he forced them out. "Without proper identification, there are procedures," he said, the sentence rehearsed, familiar, a shield he had used many times before. Yet now it sounded different even to him, thinner somehow, less certain, as if the room itself had begun to question it. And Evelyn gave a small nod, not agreement, not submission, just acknowledgement, and replied, "Then follow them, officer, but do not forget why they exist." And the simplicity of it settled over the space heavier than any raised voice could have, because it left no room for dismissal, no easy way to move past what had just been said. And once again the station fell into that same suspended quiet, the kind that waited, not for noise, but for something to change. Lucas Hale did not respond right away, and that delay was enough for the room to feel it, a subtle shift in control that did not announce itself, but settled into the air like a quiet weight. And his fingers tightened slightly around the pen before he set it down with more force than necessary, the plastic edge clicking against the clipboard in a sharp, contained sound that echoed just enough to draw a few glances from across the station. And he straightened again, shoulders squared, as if resetting himself into the version of authority he trusted most, the version that did not hesitate, the version that did not get questioned by a woman standing calmly in front of him. "You do not tell me how to do my job," he said, the words controlled but edged now, not loud, not explosive, but firm in a way that was meant to close the space between them, to re-establish the boundary he believed had been crossed. And yet, even as he spoke, there was something in the tone that lacked the certainty it had carried earlier, as if the repetition of authority did not land with the same force when it was no longer unquestioned. Evelyn Brooks did not react the way he expected. There was no flinch, no defensive reply, no retreat into silence. She simply adjusted the sleeve of her coat with a small, deliberate motion, smoothing the fabric at her wrist as if preparing herself not for confrontation but for patience. And when she spoke again, her voice remained even, unchanged by a shift in tone. "And I am not asking you to do anything outside of it," she said, her words measured, clear, leaving no room for misinterpretation. And that clarity lingered in the space between them longer than his assertion had, because it did not challenge him, it held him accountable. Somewhere behind the front desk a phone rang once, then stopped, unanswered, as if even the routine functions of the station had paused to observe what was unfolding. And a younger officer near the filing cabinets glanced toward Lucas, then back to Evelyn, his expression unreadable but attentive, absorbing more than he was willing to say aloud. Lucas inhaled slowly through his nose, the breath controlled, deliberate, and he reached again toward his belt, not grasping anything this time, but letting his hand rest there. A gesture that suggested readiness more than action, a signal more than a step, and he leaned slightly forward over the counter, narrowing the distance by inches that felt more significant than feet. Without identification, I cannot verify anything you are telling me, he continued, returning to procedure, to language that was structured, defensible, safe. So until that is resolved, you will remain here. And the final words carried a quiet finality, not aggressive but definitive, as if the decision had already been made regardless of what followed. Evelyn listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her breathing even, and for a moment her eyes drifted past him again, this time toward the entrance of the station where the glass doors reflected a faint outline of movement outside, shapes passing by in the morning light, lives continuing beyond this room, beyond this moment. And when her attention returned to him, there was something almost gentle in it, not soft, not yielding, but understanding in a way that did not excuse what was happening, only acknowledged it, and she nodded once, a small motion that carried more weight than agreement, and said quietly, "Then I will remain." And the simplicity of that answer removed any sense of resistance he could push against, leaving him with nothing to counter, nothing to escalate without revealing more than he intended. And that absence of friction created a new kind of tension, one that did not rise in volume, but settled deeper, more difficult to dismiss. The fluorescent lights flickered briefly overhead, a momentary dip in brightness that passed almost instantly, but left the room feeling slightly altered, as if something unseen had shifted just enough to be noticed without being named. And Lucas straightened again, stepping back half a pace, the clipboard still in his hand, but his focus no longer entirely on the form, because for the first time since the interaction began, the situation was no longer moving in a direction he fully controlled. And though nothing visible had changed, though no one had raised their voice, no one had stepped in, no rules had been broken, the balance in the room had begun to tilt in a way that could not be undone by procedure alone. The room did not move forward, it tightened, settling into a stillness that no one claimed but everyone felt, and Lucas Hale shifted his weight behind the counter, the faint squeak of his boots against the polished floor breaking the silence for a fraction of a second before it was swallowed again, and he glanced toward the side monitor, tapping a few keys with deliberate force as if the sound itself could reinforce control, pulling up a database screen that cast a cool blue glow across his face, sharpening the lines of his expression, making him look more distant, more procedural, more certain than he actually felt in that moment. "We will run a verification," he said, not looking at Evelyn Brooks as he spoke, his eyes fixed on the screen, scanning fields that remained blank, empty boxes waiting to be filled with something official, something documented, something that could be measured and confirmed. And when nothing immediate appeared, his jaw tightened slightly, a subtle reaction but enough to reveal that the process was not giving him what he wanted as quickly as he expected. Evelyn stood quietly, her presence unchanged, her hands now resting lightly in front of her, fingers loosely interlaced, not defensive, not withdrawn, simply composed, and the faint scent of lavender followed her in a way that softened the sterile air of the station, almost unnoticeable but present enough to contrast with the coldness of the environment. And she turned her head slightly, as if listening to something beyond the immediate tension, perhaps the distant hum of traffic outside, perhaps the muted rhythm of footsteps passing on the sidewalk beyond the glass doors. Lucas exhaled again, this time less controlled, and turned back toward her. "If your identification was lost, there should be a report, a record, something that confirms your claim," he said, the words structured but now carrying a trace of insistence, as though repetition might produce the certainty he was looking for. And he lifted the clipboard again, flipping a page with a sharp motion that echoed louder than intended. "When did you last have it?" he asked, pen poised, waiting, and Evelyn met his gaze without hesitation. 3 days ago," she answered, her tone steady. "I came here that same afternoon, but I was told to return today." And the simplicity of her response created a pause that lingered just long enough to be noticed, because it introduced something new into the equation, something that suggested this was not the first time she had stood in this space, not the first time she had followed the process exactly as instructed. Lucas's pen hovered above the page for a moment before he wrote, slower this time, the strokes less confident, and he glanced briefly toward one of the officers behind him as if considering whether to confirm her statement. But the officer only looked back uncertainly, offering no interruption, no correction, no support, just silence. And that silence stretched between them, amplifying the weight of what had just been said. The fluorescent lights flickered again, softer this time, and the reflection on the floor shifted slightly, catching the outline of Evelyn's shoes, worn but polished, placed firmly as if rooted, and the contrast between her stillness and Lucas's growing restlessness became more visible with each passing second, because while he moved, adjusted, tapped, and scanned, she remained constant, unshaken by the shifting tone around her. Then someone should have documented it, Lucas said finally, his voice lower now, less certain than before, and Evelyn gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the expectation itself. Someone should have, she replied, her words quiet but precise. And that answer did not accuse, did not challenge directly, but it left a space open, a gap in the system that could not be ignored. And for the first time the tension in the room was no longer centered solely on her presence, but began to expand outward, touching the process, the procedure, the unseen chain of actions that had led to this moment. A faint sound came from the hallway beyond the main office, the echo of approaching footsteps, slow but steady, and though no one turned immediately, though no one acknowledged it aloud, the rhythm of those steps seemed to enter the room before the person did, subtle but distinct, and Lucas paused mid-motion, his hand hovering above the keyboard, just for a second, just long enough to feel that something was shifting again, something outside his control, something approaching that would not be processed through a form or contained within a line on a report. And for the first time since the interaction began, he did not speak immediately, because the space was no longer his to fill. The sound of footsteps grew clearer now, measured and unhurried, echoing down the hallway with a steady rhythm that did not match the tension inside the station. And Lucas Hale's fingers paused above the keyboard completely this time, no longer pretending to continue the search, no longer filling the silence with procedural noise, because the presence approaching carried something different, something that did not belong to the ordinary flow of paperwork and minor reports. And one of the officers near the back straightened slightly, instinctively, as if recognizing that rhythm before seeing its source. The glass door to the main hallway opened with a soft hydraulic sigh, and a man stepped inside, tall, composed, dressed not in uniform but in a dark tailored suit that contrasted sharply with the standard blue and gray around him, his shoes making a quiet, deliberate sound against the floor as he walked forward without hesitation, his gaze moving once across the room, not searching, not uncertain, but assessing, precise, controlled, and when his eyes settled near the front desk, something in the air shifted again, deeper this time, like a current changing direction beneath still water. Evelyn Brooks did not turn immediately, but there was a subtle change in her posture, not tension, not surprise, just a quiet recognition that passed through her shoulders, a slight lift of her chin, as if she had been aware of that presence even before it entered the room. And when she finally turned her head, her expression remained calm, unchanged, but her eyes softened just enough to suggest familiarity, not dependency, not relief, simply acknowledgement. Lucas straightened quickly, stepping away from the counter by a fraction, his body reacting before his thoughts fully caught up, and he glanced at the newcomer, then at the others in the room, noticing the way a few of them had already adjusted their stance, their attention shifting in a way that did not need to be announced, and he cleared his throat, attempting to regain the structure of the moment. "Sir, this is an active situation," he said, his voice controlled but carrying a note of formality that had not been there before, as if instinctively recognizing rank even before it was confirmed. The man did not respond immediately, his steps slowing as he approached the front desk, stopping just a few feet from Evelyn. And for a moment he said nothing, his gaze moving from Lucas to the clipboard, to the computer screen, then finally resting on Evelyn herself. And in that brief silence there was no tension in his posture, no visible irritation, only a quiet focus that seemed to take in everything at once. And when he spoke his voice was low, even, carrying authority without effort. "Explain," he said, not directed at any one person but filling the space in a way that required an answer. Lucas inhaled, quickly assembling the narrative he had been following. She arrived without identification and is unable to verify her identity, he stated, the words coming faster now, more structured, as if the presence of someone higher in authority required precision, and he gestured lightly toward the clipboard. I am following standard procedure. And for a brief moment the explanation hung there, complete, logical, defensible, exactly as it should be. The man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, and then his gaze shifted slightly, not to challenge, not to dismiss, but to consider, and he looked at Evelyn again, his voice softening just enough to carry something personal beneath the authority. Ma'am, he said, a simple acknowledgement that carried more respect than anything spoken in the room so far, and Evelyn met his eyes, her response quiet but clear. I came when they told me to, she said. I followed every step, and the words settled into the space with a weight that did not need to be raised to be felt. Lucas's grip on the clipboard tightened slightly, the edges pressing into his palm, and for the first time the situation no longer felt contained within his control or his interpretation, because the presence that had just entered did not rely on assumptions or quick conclusions. It required clarity, and that clarity was beginning to reveal the gaps he had not accounted for, the details he had moved past too quickly, and as the room held its breath again, the balance shifted once more, not abruptly, not dramatically, but enough that Lucas could feel it, the subtle but undeniable realization that the moment was no longer unfolding according to his lead, and whatever came next would not be shaped by procedure alone. The room did not rush to fill the silence after Evelyn's words. It settled deeper into it, as if even the air understood that something more important than procedure was being weighed, and the man in the dark suit remained still for a moment longer, his gaze steady on her, not searching for inconsistencies, not measuring her against a checklist, but listening in a way that did not require interruption. And when he finally shifted his attention back toward Lucas Hale, the movement was slow, deliberate, carrying a quiet authority that did not need to announce itself to be recognized. Lucas straightened instinctively, his shoulders pulling back, his grip tightening slightly on the clipboard as though it were something solid he could rely on, and he cleared his throat again, softer this time, less performative. Sir, like I said, there is no valid identification on record at the moment, he repeated, his tone more measured now, each word chosen carefully, as if precision alone could stabilize the situation, and he gestured toward the computer screen, still displaying incomplete data fields that seemed to emphasize the absence he was relying on. The man stepped closer to the counter, not abruptly, not aggressively, but with purpose, and he placed one hand lightly on the surface, the gesture calm, controlled, yet grounding the moment in a way that drew attention without force, and he glanced briefly at the screen, then at the clipboard, then back at Lucas. You said she came here 3 days ago, he stated, not asking, simply confirming, and Lucas hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. That is what she claims, he replied, the choice of words careful, distancing, and the man's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, as if isolating the exact point where the narrative no longer aligned cleanly. Evelyn remained quiet, her hands still loosely folded, her breathing steady, and the faint reflection of the overhead lights traced softly along the edge of her coat, highlighting the stillness she had maintained from the beginning, a stillness that now seemed less like patience and more like certainty, as if she had already accepted whatever outcome would come and therefore had nothing left to prove. The man turned his head slightly toward the back of the room. Who was on duty that afternoon? He asked, his voice even, carrying across the station. Without effort. And for a moment no one responded, not because they did not hear him, but because the question reached further than the immediate interaction, touching something that required acknowledgement. Beyond convenience. And then the younger officer near the filing cabinets shifted, raising a hand slightly. I was, sir, he said, his voice cautious but clear, and the man nodded once. Did she come in? He asked, and the officer hesitated, glancing briefly toward Lucas before answering. Yes, sir, she did. And that simple confirmation settled into the room with a weight that changed everything without needing to raise its volume. Lucas's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly, but enough to reveal that the ground beneath his certainty was no longer stable, and he opened his mouth as if to respond, to clarify, to redirect, but no immediate words came, because the structure he had been relying on was now incomplete, missing a step that could not be ignored. The man turned back to Evelyn, his posture softening just slightly. "Ma'am, did anyone file your report?" he asked, and she shook her head once. Not frustrated, not surprised, just stating a fact without embellishment. "No, sir, they told me to come back today." And the simplicity of her answer carried more clarity than any explanation that had come before it. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, the sound now more noticeable in the quiet that followed, and Lucas lowered the clipboard slightly, the paper edges brushing softly against the counter as if the object itself had lost some of its authority. And in that moment, nothing dramatic happened, no raised voices, no sudden movement, but the shift was undeniable, because the situation was no longer about verifying her identity. It was about acknowledging what had already been overlooked, and Lucas could feel it, the slow, steady realization settling in, that this was not a matter of procedure being followed, but of something having been missed, and now, in front of someone who would not ignore it, that absence was becoming impossible to justify. The confirmation did not echo loudly, but it landed with a finality that no one in the room could ignore, and the man in the dark suit let the silence sit for a moment longer, allowing the weight of that simple truth to settle fully into the space, before he straightened slightly and turned his body. Just enough to face Lucas Hale directly, his posture still calm, but now unmistakably authoritative. Then the process was not followed, he said, not accusing, not raising his voice, but stating it as a fact that required no embellishment, and the words seemed to draw a clear line through everything that had happened so far, separating assumption from reality. Lucas opened his mouth, then closed it again, the response forming but not holding, because every explanation he might have offered depended on something that had already been disproven, and he shifted his weight subtly, the movement small but revealing, as his hand lowered fully from his belt, no longer hovering, no longer signaling control, and the clipboard in his other hand dipped slightly, the edge now resting against the counter instead of being held firmly above it. The man's gaze remained steady on him, not aggressive, not confrontational, but unyielding in a way that made avoidance impossible. "What is your name?" he asked, though the badge was visible, though the information was already known, and Lucas swallowed once before answering. "Deputy Lucas Hale." His voice quieter now, less certain than before, and the man gave a single nod, acknowledging the response without comment before continuing. "Deputy Hale, step aside." And the instruction was delivered in the same, even tone, but this time it carried something unmistakable, a shift from observation to action. Lucas hesitated for half a second, just enough for the room to notice, before he complied, taking a small step back from the counter, creating space that had not existed moments earlier. And in that space the dynamic changed completely, because the authority he had held at the front desk no longer belonged to him. It had been reassigned without force, without spectacle, simply through clarity. The man then turned fully toward Evelyn Brooks, his expression softening in a way that contrasted sharply with the tension that had filled the room earlier, and for the first time since he had entered, there was something personal in his presence, something beyond duty, beyond procedure, and he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, retrieving a slim leather holder, opening it briefly to reveal an identification that he did not need to announce, because the reaction around the room spoke for him. Subtle shifts in posture, quiet recognition, the unspoken understanding of rank, and he closed it again just as calmly, returning it to his pocket before speaking. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience you have experienced," he said, the words formal but sincere, carrying a weight that did not feel rehearsed, and Evelyn met his gaze, her expression unchanged in its calmness. But there was a faint warmth in her eyes now, not relief, not triumph, just acknowledgement of respect being restored. The man paused for a brief moment, then added, more quietly, "You should not have had to return." And that sentence settled deeper than any apology, because it addressed not just the moment, but the failure that had led to it. And Evelyn gave a small nod, accepting the truth of it without needing anything further. Behind them, Lucas stood. Still, the absence of movement more noticeable now than any action had been before, and his gaze dropped briefly to the counter, then lifted again, but this time not with authority, not with certainty, but with something closer to realization, as if the structure he had relied on had been quietly dismantled piece by piece, leaving him to see the situation without the shield of assumption. The fluorescent lights above cast a steady glow across the room, no longer flickering, no longer shifting. And in that steady light the scene resolved into something clearer, something undeniable, not loud, not dramatic, but precise. And as the man turned slightly, positioning himself beside Evelyn rather than in front of her, the final shift completed itself, because the balance of the room had changed entirely, and for the first time since the interaction began, the truth was not being argued, it was simply being seen. The shift did not come with raised voices or sudden movement. It came quietly, settling into the room like a truth that no longer needed to defend itself, and the man in the dark suit remained beside Evelyn Brooks, not in front of her, not shielding her, but standing with her in a way that restored something that had been missing from the moment since it began, and he turned his attention briefly toward the younger officer near the back. "Retrieve the intake log from 3 days ago," he said, his tone even, and the officer nodded immediately, moving without hesitation now, pulling open a drawer and flipping through a stack of printed reports with careful urgency. The rustle of paper breaking the stillness in a way that felt purposeful rather than disruptive. Lucas Hale remained where he had stepped back, his posture no longer rigid but not relaxed either, caught somewhere in between as he watched the process unfold without his direction, and his eyes moved once toward Evelyn, then away again, as if uncertain where to place his attention now that the situation no longer aligned with his earlier assumptions. The officer returned with a thin packet of documents, handing them over with both hands, and the man in the suit accepted them, scanning the pages with a practiced eye, each line reviewed not quickly but thoroughly, and as he turned a page, his finger paused on a section near the bottom, a faint indentation where a report should have been completed but was not, a blank space that spoke louder than any written statement. He lifted the page slightly, angling it toward Lucas without raising his voice. "This is where the report should be," he said, the words simple, precise, leaving no room for interpretation, and Lucas stepped closer by instinct, his gaze following the indicated line, and for a moment he said nothing, because the absence was clear, undeniable, not something that could be explained away by procedure or timing. It was simply missing. Evelyn watched quietly, her hands still folded, her presence unchanged, and there was no satisfaction in her expression, no sense of victory, only a steady calm that had been there from the beginning, as if the outcome had never been about proving something to anyone else, only about standing in what she knew to be true. The man lowered the document and closed the folder gently, the sound soft but final, and he turned his attention fully to Lucas again. "You had an opportunity to correct this today," he said, not harshly, not with anger, but with a clarity that carried more weight than either, and Lucas's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension in his stance shifting into something quieter, more internal, and he nodded once, not in defense, not in argument, but in acknowledgement, because there was nothing left to contest. The man then looked back at Evelyn, his tone softening once more. "We will complete your report properly now," he said, and she gave a small nod, accepting the statement without hesitation, and for the first time since she had entered the station, the process began to move forward in the way it should have from the start, not rushed, not forced, but aligned, each step grounded in attention rather than assumption. Behind them, the station resumed a subtle rhythm, not loud, not busy, but no longer frozen, and the fluorescent lights cast a steady glow across the counter where the blank line had been, now waiting to be filled, and as Lucas reached for a pen again, his movement slower, more deliberate than before, there was a noticeable change in the way he held it, not as a tool of control, but as a responsibility, and in that small, almost invisible adjustment, something deeper shifted, because the moment was no longer about authority being asserted, it was about it being understood.